Next up on the broadcast, Katherine Robertson from the Alabama Policy Institute is back on the program with us. Katherine, it's nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Don.
You're down here every day during the legislative session, are you not?
I am making the drive from Birmingham.
A lot to keep up with this year, right?
Yeah, it's finally starting to get exciting.
Now, let's refresh folks' memory on API, what the Policy Institute is all about. You're a think tank, right?
That's right. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, conservative think tank, and we focus on really any issue that follows under our mission of promoting free markets, limited government, and strong families.
Without going too far into the weeds, you've been privy firsthand to a lot of the general fund budget debate this week, especially today with the general fund being in the Senate. The plan that was under consideration is really considered just a vehicle at this point that there will be a lot of negotiation over as it moves to the House. But what was making the most headlines about it was Medicaid, that they were proposing level funding Medicaid, while the agency has asked for at least a $100 million increase. That's really bringing the general fund debate down, don't you think, to a Medicaid debate?
Yeah, and it's not surprising since Medicaid accounts right now for almost 40% of the entire general fund budget. And this year, with new tax revenue not likely, you know, we have to work with what we've got, and with Medicaid consuming such a big part of the general fund, really corrections in Medicaid are really what the general fund debate is usually about.
Medicaid Commissioner Stephanie Azar, of course, has asked for, as I mentioned, at least a $100 million increase. She says without it, services will have to be cut, and the federal funds that were recently approved for us for startup of the regional care organizations under Medicaid might be in jeopardy, because a caveat of those funds is maintaining our current Medicaid system. So there are a whole lot of challenges at work here. There
are. You know, Medicaid's one of those topics where federal funding does make up such a large part. I think we actually spend about $4 billion a year on Medicaid, but only about $1 billion of that is state dollars. So when federal dollars are in play, it's always a little bit sensitive because you have to spend so much to get so much. And so it's difficult a lot of times to really cut Medicaid funding because you don't want to lose what's coming in. But then also we don't really have a lot of wiggle room on cost savings or efficiencies because so much of that is regulated by the federal government.
From the outside looking in, and we talked about this last time you were on the show, this zero-based budgeting philosophy that lawmakers said they were going to try to operate under this year. Have they stuck to their guns there, do you think?
I think they've tried. I mean, I do feel like, especially with the regular and the two special sessions last year, I think it's more than just budget committee members that are paying attention now. I think everybody has just a stronger level of education on our spending and all such as that. So I think that, you know, I think they've started taking steps towards zero-based budgeting, you know, starting with the hearings back in January. But, you know, some of it, you really run into a time crunch. They only have 30 legislative days, and, you know, they can dig as deeply as they can in that time, but then they start to sort of get a sense of urgency to get it passed.
With the Senate taking up the general fund today, that's a lot earlier than we've seen it come up in previous sessions. There seems to be a real commitment this year to get these budgets moving early. I know there's also a commitment of possibly having the education budget done by spring break.
That's right. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, you know, it's interesting, the budget chairman switching places in the Senate. You know, maybe that has something to do with just a sort of a fresh approach. You know, it never hurts to have a fresh set of eyes. I think also there's just, you know, again, without tax increases being really on the table, everybody just sort of understands that we have what we have, and I just don't think the debate's going to drag on as long. And of course, the ETF is really in good fiscal shape, so that budget generally has a pretty easy time anyway.
Speaking of the ETF, briefly, Governor Bentley had proposed unearmarking some more money from the education budget to help the general fund, but we've heard really no appetite to do that among a majority of lawmakers that we've spoken with. As a matter of fact, the general fund budget that the Senate was considering today did not include any of that.
That's right. I think that, you know, there was sort of a deal that would be a one-time transfer last year, and I think that really, like you said, the majority of legislators do not want that to be a solution. They voted for the Rolling Reserve Act so that the Education Trust Fund would have, you know, dollars saved in reserves. And, you know, I think that there are underlying problems in the general fund, mainly that it is funded with taxes that don't grow. So there's just some underlying problems that need to be addressed there. And I don't think anybody wants any more quick fixes, particularly when it's coming from education.
We did move that one growth revenue stream from the ETF to the general fund
That's right.
last year. Now, that's a good thing, but it's going to take a while for us to start reaping the benefits of that, right?
That's true. We moved part of a tax over to the general fund, and it'll take some time to see that, certainly. But again, all in all, when you look at the two budgets and how they're divided, growth revenue goes into one and stagnant revenues go into the other. So this problem is probably going to be one that will be dealt with a lot.
Katherine, has the Policy Institute been monitoring this minimum wage debate? We had the bill in the Senate today that would bar cities and counties from setting their own minimum wage levels. It was really spurred in most part by Birmingham instituting its own wage increase.
Yeah, well, as you know, our offices are in Birmingham, and so we've heard from just a number of business owners, particularly some franchise owners, that are really concerned about this because they say, how can we justify to our employees outside of Jefferson County a lower wage, and they made the point that they spend a whole lot on benefits and other, fringe benefits of their employees that certainly aren't accounted for in a minimum wage. So by all accounts, it looks like the legislature plans to put a hold on that this afternoon.
Yeah, the Birmingham has taken a couple of preemptive strikes, of course, in recent weeks. First, they moved implementation up of their wage increase from July 1st to March 1st, and then they said they were going to move it from March 1st to almost immediately. Right. But the Attorney General told them they would have to give businesses ample time to get ready for something like this. Now, Representative David Faulkner, who sponsored this legislation to bar cities and counties from setting their own wage levels, has basically said it's a uniformity issue to him. It's not about setting the minimum wage level. He's just saying that whatever it is needs to be uniform in this state.
Yeah, I think it's a really fair point, because if you have a patchwork of different minimum wages across the state, that can contribute to hurting Alabama's overall economy, and certainly Jefferson County, of all places, where so many of our businesses are located and such a big chunk of our economy comes from, I think is a very valid point.
On the other side of the coin, though, there have been some pretty passionate debates on the House and Senate floor concerning making the poor poorer.
Right.
Lawmakers maybe not having enough empathy for what it's like to have to live off a minimum wage.
Well, I think you heard sort of some rebuttal to that many on the other side have in fact worked in minimum wage jobs, but I think it just probably comes down to a difference in philosophy. Our conservative free market philosophy is that people do better the more government gets out of the way. Certainly things like the Affordable Care Act that add cost to businesses, those are things that if the government would sort of step back and let the free market work, wages may come up anyway. And I think certainly the intent on either side is not a lack of concern about the poor. It's just a difference in philosophy. Our philosophy at API would be that if you force the minimum wage up, then a lot of the people you're trying to help will end up not having those jobs.
Katherine, in the midst of all of this week, a lot of your attention has been focused on pension reform, which is going to be an issue also in the session coming up.
Yeah, the legislature's Joint Committee on Public Pensions continues to meet. As you can imagine, with such a complex topic and frankly a dry one, the meetings are long and lots of numbers and lots of data are shared. But I do think it's positive that we're having this debate. I think that the budget shortfall last year sort of prompted a closer look at all of our state spending, but particularly public pensions, where we're currently spending about $1 billion a year to make those whole. So I think it's been a very healthy debate. I think that legislators probably know more about pensions now than they ever have before, and I'm excited about the prospects of some reform in the future. Yeah,
making those holes up, as you put it, that's key in this debate, because what the state is having to do is pump a lot of money to fill in the holes that the investments don't pay for, right?
That's right, and unfortunately, because of the pension debt that we have already accrued, most recently during the recession of 2008 and beyond, our payback schedule to pay off that debt and to make our employer contribution looks like it'll be over $2 billion in about 20 years, which we know money is so tight around here that would be awfully difficult to come by and awfully hard to ask taxpayers to contribute, since the public retirement of a lot of people in the state is better than a lot of retirement plans in the private sector.
So are you optimistic we can get some meaningful legislation out this year?
I'm optimistic that we'll take some meaningful steps forward. Again, you sometimes wonder about the calendar on big decisions like this, but I'm very optimistic generally about the effort.
There is a very concerted effort being made. You mentioned the commission that's been working tirelessly on this issue. So it's up on the priority list.
That's right.
And that's encouraging, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Katherine, you've also been focusing a lot of attention on Amendment 1, which will be on the primary ballot on Tuesday. We want to make sure that voters realize there's going to be an amendment on the ballot next year, and let's educate them a little about what's at stake.
Amendment 1 would allow some cost-saving reforms to the Judicial Retirement Fund to be implemented. It was a bill that was passed last session. And basically, the state has 3 public pension funds: the Employers' Retirement System, the Teachers' Retirement System, and the Judicial Retirement Fund. Due to some cost concerns back in 2011 and 2012, the legislature raised the employee contribution and did some other measures that would save costs for those 2 plans. But none of those reforms were applied to the Judicial Retirement Fund. Now the legislature has come back and passed basically these same reforms to apply to the employees in that plan.
Now, who falls under the Judicial Retirement Fund? Obviously, judges do, but there are others, district attorneys, for example.
Right, judges, district attorneys, clerks. And the amendment will apply to each group a little bit differently, but overall, all of their contributions will be raised, again, to alleviate the burden on the state just a little bit, because out of the 3 pension funds we have, the Judicial Fund is the worst funded. It's only funded at 58%, and the taxpayers will put in about $18 million this year to make that fund whole, which is up about 74% over the last 10 years. Keep in mind, it's the smallest of the 3 funds. There are only about 330 current employees in that fund, so it's a pretty substantial problem. The amount that the state's putting in right now accounts for about 40% of the whole judicial payroll. So at a time when we're worried about courts receiving adequate funding, this amendment makes a lot of sense, and we certainly hope that it will pass.
Are judicial employees on board?
They are on board. I think that, when the plan is in the shape that it's in, both current retirees and current employees both want to make sure that the promises that have been made to them can be kept. And I think by reining in the cost a little bit, it will help better secure their retirement. So I've talked to multiple DAs and judges, and really all stakeholders seem to be on board with this amendment's passage.
So they're willing to pay a little more looking toward the long term, right?
That's right. That's right.
I want to talk about the mood this session, if we could, Katherine, for a moment. There was so much made last year of the tension and the passion surrounding a regular session and 2 special sessions to get a general fund budget passed. There were a lot of divisions, even in parties there were divisions over this issue. That seems to be vastly improved this year. Is that your impression? That's
right. There was a lot of division within the 2 Republican caucuses specifically, and I think a lot of that was surrounding the budget debate and really the split over tax increases. That was a very divisive issue. People have very strong feelings, and you also kind of had the gambling issue that came into play a little bit surprisingly. So it does seem like this year, the budget's in a little bit better shape. Tax increases really aren't on the table, so it does seem like they're in a posture to really want to get some things done.
Katherine, that spirit of cooperation will be beneficial on a lot of levels this year, because there are a lot of other big things coming up besides the general fund. For instance, teacher pay and teacher tenure reform. That's
right. Senator Marsh has been working on a bill that will have some tenure reform elements to it, along with the teacher pay, as you mentioned. Since the Education Trust Fund is healthy this year, they're hoping to do a pay raise. And then you're also seeing things like the minimum wage debate that's been going on today. You've seen the prison reform elements that they're starting to be implemented. So there does seem to be a spirit of cooperation, and certainly the hope is that they'll be able to tackle some important topics.
In these last few minutes, I also wanted to talk about the Mike Hubbard quotient and all this, if I could, because there's been a lot of heated debate surrounding the speaker and whether he should have stepped down from his leadership position while the ethics case against him is resolved. He said he could do both, and there seems to be a strong contingent supporting him to do both. Now, there's obviously division over this, but by and large, his colleagues seem to be behind him.
Yeah, that's certainly the same perception that I have. I think that the House obviously has their agenda that they're trying to work through, bills that they want to see passed, and they have always been very loyal to their leader. He's guided them, over the years, and they've always looked to him. And so I think you'll continue to see that as long as he's serving. They'll continue to follow. And I think even the ones that may have sort of defected a little bit, they seem to be, wanting to work in the spirit of cooperation, as you said, and again, just to get some of these big ticket items done.
Speaker Hubbard has certainly moved aggressively in the early going of the session. They had a very short, concise caucus agenda early on, and all of those bills have already passed out of the House. I'm thinking of things like economic incentive bills, right to work, infant's dignity of life, those sorts of things. They've already all passed the House, so he is making efficient business of running the House so far, at least.
He has, and he, came into the session saying we want to get to the budgets early. We don't want to do like we did last year and let too much time go by and then be scrambling, to agree on a budget. So I think in that regard, he's done a fantastic job getting them to that point, because as we've discussed, they're getting to the budgets early, and that should allow ample time for debate.
You optimistic we're going to have a productive session?
I am. We're still early in the session, but I'm optimistic.
Indeed. Katherine Robertson with the Alabama Policy Institute. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Don. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for being here. You bet. And Capitol Journal. We'll be right back.